Bob Ryan, who's another legendary sports chronicler, and he tweeted the following. So Aparicio is now the oldest living Baseball Hall of Famer.
Yes,
Clearly, at the beginning of this week, the greatest living ball player was Willie Mays, as Joe DiMaggio always used to be introduced. And then I think some people may have passed that honor to Ted Williams, and now Willie is no longer with us. So Bob tweeted, "Let the argument begin. Who is the greatest living ball player?" He subsequently tweeted, "Clearly this question about greatest living ball player comes down to the question between those who include Barry Bonds and those who refuse to." So my question to you, Bob, is how would you answer that question? Who is now the greatest living ball player?
I think you could make a very good and clean, no pun intended, case for pre-steroid Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds was that combination of speed and legitimate power prior to the late 90s. There's a clear line of demarcation for what followed in his career after that. But I think you could make a case for Bonds. You could certainly make a case for Ken Griffey Jr. You could make a case now for Shohei Ohtani, who's a unicorn. You could make a case for Mike Trout during the best years of his career. And I'm probably forgetting somebody who should be included. A-Rod, look at his numbers. They're amazing. A-Rod is also in a kind of a netherworld in terms of how people think about him. If you're just talking about hitting, look at the numbers, kind of obscured outside St. Louis because of the steroid era, but look at Albert Pujols' numbers, not as an Angel or toward the very end as a Dodger. Look at his prime years with the Cardinals. Those are staggering numbers.
Hembo, he's of all the players who are still alive, the highest WAR overwhelmingly is Bonds. It's not even close. A-Rod is second. Ricky Henderson is third. Mike Schmidt is fourth. And then, as Bob mentions, Albert Pujols is fifth.
I think the answer to this question has to be Bonds and has to be Clemens. And if you're going to stray away from steroid users, Bob, I'm curious, where would you put Sandy Koufax on this list? He seems to be sort of the last vestige, if you will, of that generation. And I think a lot of older fans would immediately point to Koufax as being the greatest living ball player.
Well, the case against Koufax, and who wants to make any case against Sandy Koufax, but it's longevity. There's a 4 or 5 year stretch where he's just absolutely magnificent in every way. 4 consecutive years with a no-hitter, capped by his perfect game in 1965. So if we're talking about the peak, very good case to be made for Sandy. But others who were either direct contemporaries overlapped him. Warren Spahn won more than 360 games. I think he won 13 times. There's Bob Gibson. You'd make a tremendous case for him. Even as you mentioned, Clemens, Maddox is a contemporary. Randy Johnson is a contemporary. I'm leaving some other people out. So it's a difficult case to make, I guess, for any one person. But something that comes to mind as I go off on a side street here, and in talking about Willie over the last day and a half, this occurs to me. Somehow, when you talk about the truly great players, at least of the past, the greatness of any one of them does not dim or diminish the standing or the place in the imagination of the other. Ted Williams had better numbers than Stan Musial, as great as Stan Musial's numbers were. But Ted was the splendid splinter, and Stan was Stan the man, and Stan is the guy in St. Louis and a huge part of the Midwest because the Cardinals were the southernmost and westernmost team. Nothing that Williams did, nothing that DiMaggio did, nothing that any of them as contemporaries did diminishes the other. Nothing that we've just said about Willie Mays diminishes the distinctive place that Hank Aaron has in baseball history and in American history for reasons we don't have to explain now. You can compare their statistics. People are obsessed with rankings, and certainly Willie and Hank would always be somewhere in the top half dozen players of all time. But Willie has a different place in the imagination than Hank, and Hank's greatness and what he achieved doesn't diminish Willie. Same thing with Mickey Mantle, who regretted till the end of his life that he didn't fulfill his potential and that by playing too long his lifetime batting average fell under 300. But Mickey Mantle is the embodiment of Bernard Malamud's Roy Hobbs in the book The Natural and Robert Redford in the movie The Natural. Nothing diminishes Mantle's place on that list. Bob Gibson doesn't diminish Sandy Koufax because they're distinctly different. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about this. This isn't like, oh, this is the best guy, and here's the next guy. These aren't matters of degree necessarily when you talk about the all-time greats. They all exist in the imagination, not just in the record books, in distinct fashion.
That's true, and it probably is the way it should be. But I, Bob, have lived in this talk show world for a long time, and one of the things, and maybe just because it's the easiest thing to fall back on, but if you were trying to create a provocative subject, the easiest way to do it is literally to say, well, who's better, that guy or that guy? And I come by this honestly. My dad, who dedicated his first book to Joe DiMaggio, even though it had nothing to do with sports, because my dad was just a kid from the Bronx who grew up worshiping Joe DiMaggio. If you ever tried to tell him that any player was better than DiMaggio, I don't think he was ever in a fight literally in his entire life. And he would have fought you on that tooth and nail, and he would have pointed out all the years that DiMaggio lost to the war and all this kind of stuff. So there is some degree of who's better that, while I understand your point, there is some degree of who's better that has sort of driven the conversation at the same time.
Oh, yeah, but people want a binary discussion very often, and there are shades of gray and there are nuances. You know, a guy I didn't mention a moment ago is Roberto Clemente. His power stats don't match up with the other guys that were part of what I just said, but he has a separate place in the imagination that no one else can touch. The first Hispanic superstar in MLB, his distinctive style in right field, and then he dies while still in the prime of his life, maybe toward the end of his baseball life. He dies as a hero on a mission of mercy, taking supplies to earthquake victims in Nicaragua. If you talk to people in Puerto Rico or Hispanic fans, I mean, obviously he's beloved by all fans, but he meant something to a certain portion of American baseball fans, both then and now in memory, that Willie Mays cannot, that Hank Aaron or Mickey Mantle cannot. That's the point I'm trying to make here.
Where did that quote come from that we had in the book about him being the Latin America's Jackie Robinson? Was that something that was just colloquially said, or was that actually a direct quote? Do you remember now? Because it's in the book.
I do remember what you're referencing. Let me pull it up to be certain.
I'm just trying to remember, because that probably encapsulates it as well as anything can.